Hello, History Class 713. In a survey conducted in 2018, over 64% of American households owns a device to play video games. 60% of them play every day, and 70% of parents say video games positively impact their children. In 2017, consumers spent $38 billion on the video game industry. However, there was a time when video games as a whole almost died out. In the video game crash of 1983, the industry fractured from the seams. Atari, which ran supreme in the early 70s, fell, and there was a hole left in its wake. Through pop culture mythos, the video game E.T., one of the worst video games of all time, has been blamed for Atari's demise. However, the crash requires a much more thorough analysis. The research question addressed in my research of the last 7 weeks sought to determine what caused the video game crash of 1983, what role did Atari truly play in the crash, and how did Nintendo rise from the ashes and remain supreme in the early 1900s? The significance of the research questions. The research questions are significant in a myriad of reasons. The first is that video game history as a whole has only recently gained more magnitude, yet is still largely lacking. The second is that pop culture analysis has taken the front seat in video game history and analysis. Historical analysis very much not on the radar. Third, I believe video game history, specifically the video game crash of 1983, and the rise of Nintendo is an excellent way to blend storytelling, history, economics, and go past pop culture, urban legends, and mythos while still keeping the public interested. My research sought to go past pop culture and nostalgia and pinpoint actual causes based on both qualitative and quantifiable means. I sought to use a few theoretical frameworks merging economics, pop culture, and history. To be more specific, I looked at market trends, video game sales, and consumer confidence. For the more sociological aspect, I used oral interviews, video game magazines, video game movies, and advertisements. For the historical, I used a lot of primary sources deriving from the video game archives, such as the Learning Game Initiative or the Atari Museum. As far as key primary sources, I used a lot of interviews, such as interviews from Scott Warshaw, the creator of the E.T. video game, the creator of Pong for Atari, Al Alcorn, the founder of Atari, Nolan Bushnell, or former CEO of Atari, James Heller, who got fired after he sold off a bunch of Time Warner stocks right before the market crash of 1983, and of course, interviews from the Mario Brothers game creators, Shigeru Miyamoto and Toshiki Tezuka. Secondly, I dived as much as I could into source material, such as looking at original patents, patents for the early pinball machines, and some of the legalities and court battles of these early video game patents. I also looked at and found a lot of advertisements for the telegame systems, Nintendo Entertainment Systems, Atari, Magnavox, and of course advertisements for television, newspaper, and magazines. Fourth, I found as much as I could statistics for video games sales, market trends, and diffusion rates. In short, I felt that quantifiable data gave a good perspective on what happened for the video game crash. However, the more qualitative interviews gave a lot of meaning and understanding to this data. As far as the research, my general thesis was that in 1983, the video game crash was caused by a lot of factors, including oversaturation of the market, too many bad games, and too much freedom with third-party developers, and competition with home computers. Moreover, Nintendo dominated the late 80s and 1990s due to its brand marketing as a family entertainment system, blue wave marketing, and strict third-party licensing, and a close adherence to the Nintendo brand. For the video game crash, I think it's important to look at the amount of software versus hardware developed. For example, in 1981, there's 4,620,000 video game hardware units sold and 34,500,000 cartridges sold. However, by 1982, that jumped up to 7,950,000 hardware units sold and a whopping 60 million cartridges sold. However, what we found in 1983, that hardware sales, they went down to 5,700,000, but cartridges jumped all the way up to 75 million. What does that show is that there is an overproduction of games compared to the hardware that consumers were buying. Not only that, but Atari went into lawsuits with Activision, Mattel, and Magnavox over third-party development games. In the fallout, third parties could make as many games as they wanted, as long as Atari was paid a fee. However, the majority of the games were absolutely terrible. Atari had a ton of poor third-party games, coupled with bad third-party licensing, and it created terrible losses across the video game industry. The poor quality games sold at below cost, and this coupled with product dumping, which caused the good games to suffer. Not only that, but by the mid-1980s, home computers, which before cost over $1,000, could now be bought between $150 and $250. Home computers could play games, but they also had educational opportunities, word processing, and they came with keyboards. Video games cost around the same amount of money, but all they could do was play video games. Consumers by this point were fed up with the terrible games and went with the home computers. Adding to this, the final nail on the coffin was the terrible E.T. video game, considered one of the worst video games of all times. Atari ordered around 4 million copies of the game, but only 1 million sold. Not only that, it's estimated that 3.5 million of the copies of the game were returned. Adding to that, it was reported that 728,000 cartridges were buried in a dump. In 2013, these cartridges were actually dug up. And one of the cartridges, an ET cartridge, found at the dump is now on the Smithsonian Institute with a catalog number of 2014.019.0. Now the question still remains, why did Atari fail and how did Nintendo come to the top? Well, Nintendo succeeded because Nintendo was a genius at marketing. They labeled the Nintendo as a family entertainment system. They used blue marketing techniques, meaning they opened the market to kids, adults, and women. It's important to point out that Atari largely ignored women in their marketing campaigns. Nintendo was also very selective on third parties. They were exceedingly strict. For example, they would not let any company release its game to any other console for 2 years after signing with Nintendo. Secondly, they limited software companies from releasing no more than 5 games for the system in the year. Lastly, Nintendo only opened up their license to create games for 16 firms. Not only that, for most of the games, Nintendo used their own in-house developers, coupled with the Nintendo Quality Seal of Excellence. In short, Nintendo limited the amount of third-party games released and ensured their quality. As far as marketing, Nintendo created over 200 Nintendo clubs all across the US. They had a world of Nintendo displays at most retailers, and they released Nintendo Power magazines, morning cartoons, and of course, the movie The Wizard, which highlighted the amazing graphics of Super Mario Bros. 3 before its release. Moreover, Nintendo also put helpline numbers in their magazines. When callers called up and got help, the people on the other end conducted market research, helping Nintendo market their products. Their marketing and strict third-party licensing was effective. For example, in 1986, Nintendo sold 1.1 million copies. However, in 1989, that number of sales jumped to 20.2 million copies. For example, Atari in the same year only sold 3 million copies. Adding to that, in 1989, Nintendo jumped up to 70% of market share. Atari only had 16%. Looking at diffusion rates, or the amount of people who had Nintendo in their households, in 1986, it was only 3%. But by 1986, the diffusion rate jumped up to 30%. Lastly, by 1990, Nintendo possessed 90% of the 3 billion home video game industry. Thank you.